The morning sun filtered through the dusty blinds of Emma Turner's modest apartment, casting long shadows across stacks of old yearbooks and carefully preserved teaching materials. After 38 years of teaching American literature at the local high school, Emma's retirement hadn't quite turned out the way she'd imagined. The silence was deafening, especially on mornings like this when the weight of solitude pressed heavily on her shoulders. She ran her fingers along the spine of a weathered copy of Hillbilly Elegy, a book she'd taught countless times in her final years of teaching. The pages were dog-eared, filled with sticky notes and margin annotations, testament to the countless discussions she'd led about resilience, social mobility, and the American dream. Emma had always believed that literature could bridge divides and open minds, especially in a small Ohio town where opportunities often seemed as scarce as rain in a drought. The familiar ache in her chest returned as she thought about her last class. Those bright young faces, full of promise. She'd spent decades trying to show her students that their circumstances didn't define their future, that education could be their ladder out of hardship. But now, in the quietness of retirement, she sometimes wondered if she'd made any difference at all. A knock at the door startled her from her reverie. Emma wasn't expecting anyone. Her daughter Isabella lived 3 states away, and her neighbor William Hall usually only checked in on Sundays. She straightened her cardigan, tucked a stray silver curl behind her ear, and made her way to the door. "Just a moment," she called out, her voice carrying the warmth that had made her classroom a haven for generations of students. Through the peephole, she could make out a tall figure in a suit, probably another real estate agent trying to convince her to sell her apartment and move to one of those sterile retirement communities. But when she opened the door, the man standing there wasn't a real estate agent at all. He was younger than she'd expected, with kind eyes that seemed somehow familiar. "Mrs. Turner?" he asked, his voice carrying traces of an Appalachian accent that reminded her of so many of her former students. "Yes," she replied, searching his face for any hint of recognition. In 38 years of teaching, faces tended to blur together, but something about him tugged at her memory. "I'm not sure if you remember me," he began, "but I wanted to thank you. You see, 15 years ago, you gave a struggling kid a copy of Native Son and told him that his story mattered too." Emma's hand flew to her heart as realization dawned. The local news coverage, the political campaigns, the best-selling memoir. Suddenly it all clicked into place, but she wasn't seeing the polished public figure. She was seeing the quiet boy who used to sit in the back of her classroom, devouring every book she recommended, as if they were messages in bottles, promising distant shores. "I was passing through town," he continued, "and I just couldn't drive by without stopping to tell you what that meant to me. What you meant to all of us who didn't believe we had stories worth telling." Emma's vision blurred with tears as memories flooded back. The passionate class discussions, the extra hours spent after school helping students with college application, essays, the quiet conversations with kids who needed someone to believe in them. She had always told her students that literature wasn't just about understanding others' stories. It was about finding the courage to tell their own. "Would you like to come in?" she managed to ask, her voice thick with emotion. "I just made some coffee." As she led him into her small living room, Emma noticed how his eyes lingered on the familiar classroom posters she'd never had the heart to take down. Steinbeck, Morrison, Angelo, voices that had helped her show generations of students that their experiences, their struggles, and their triumphs deserved to be heard. They sat among the books and memories, and as he began to speak, Emma felt the weight of her recent solitude lifting. Here was living proof that the seeds she'd planted had taken root and flourished, that all those years of believing in her students, of showing them their potential through the power of literature, hadn't been in vain. He told her about his journey, about how her class had been a turning point, how her belief in him had helped him believe in himself. But more than that, he wanted to know about her other students, about the lives she'd touched after him. As they talked, Emma realized that retirement hadn't ended her story as an educator. It had just opened a new chapter. The morning light had shifted to afternoon gold when he finally stood to leave. "Mrs. Turner," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I brought you something." He handed her a package wrapped in brown paper. "It's an advance copy of my new book. I was hoping, would you mind taking a look? Your feedback always meant the world to me." Emma's hands trembled as she held the package. Here was one of her former students, now a celebrated author, still seeking her guidance. The roles had shifted, but the connection remained, that sacred bond between teacher and student, between storyteller and listener, between past and future. As she watched him walk away, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced since her last day in the classroom: purpose. She might have retired from teaching, but she hadn't retired from making a difference. Her story, like those of her beloved literary characters, was still unfolding. She closed the door and returned to her chair, carefully unwrapping the book. A note fell from between its pages. "To Mrs. Turner, who taught me that every voice matters, especially the ones society tries to silence. Thank you for helping me find mine." Emma held the note to her heart, tears flowing freely now. In all her years of teaching, she had always told her students that literature had the power to change lives. But sitting there, surrounded by the books that had built bridges between worlds, she realized that it wasn't just the literature that had changed lives. It was the belief, the connection, the unwavering faith in human potential. She reached for her phone, suddenly eager to share this moment with Isabella. Her daughter had always said she should write down her teaching stories, preserve them for future generations. Maybe it was time. Maybe her own story deserved to be told too. As the afternoon sun painted her walls with warm light, Emma Turner began to write, a heart full of gratitude for the unexpected visitor who had reminded her that every life touches countless others, creating ripples that continue long after the initial splash. In her modest apartment, surrounded by the books and memories of a life dedicated to education, she understood that retirement wasn't an ending, it was just a different kind of beginning. That evening, Emma Turner sat in her favorite reading chair, surrounded by stacks of old teaching journals she'd pulled from her closet. The surprise visit had stirred something in her, memories she'd tucked away like pressed flowers between pages of books. Her fingers traced the worn edges of a leather-bound journal from 15 years ago, its pages filled with notes about her students, their struggles, their breakthroughs. The apartment felt different now, less like a retreat from the world and more like a treasury of untold stories. She thought about all the students who had passed through her classroom. Alexander Green, who worked 3 jobs to help his family but never missed a reading assignment. Olivia Phillips, who found her voice through poetry after years of silence. James Roberts, whose college admission essay had brought tears to her eyes. She opened the advance copy of JD's new book, but her mind kept drifting to that particular year, that particular class. It had been a challenging time for the community. The steel mill had just closed, and despair hung over the town like heavy storm clouds. She remembered how she'd changed her entire curriculum, choosing literature that spoke to resilience, to overcoming impossible odds. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was her daughter, Isabella Wright, returning her earlier call. "Mum, are you okay? Your message sounded strange." Emma's voice trembled with excitement as she recounted the morning's visit. "You remember that student I told you about? The one who wrote about his grandmother? The one who got into Yale? Mum, are you saying..." "Yes, sweetheart, he came to see me today after all these years." Emma paused, gathering her thoughts. It made me realize something. All those stories I used to tell you about my students. Maybe they're worth more than just dinner table conversation. Isabella was quiet for a moment. Mom, I've been telling you this for years. Your teaching stories, they're not just about education. They're about hope, about transformation. People need to hear them, especially now. Emma glanced at the notebook in her lap, thinking about the hundreds of stories contained within its pages. There was so much more than just literature happening. In that classroom, she said softly, did I ever tell you about the day we discussed the glass castle? She could hear the smile in Isabella's voice. Tell me again, Mom. Tell me everything. As Emma began to speak, the memories came flooding back. It was during that same difficult year when the town was reeling from the mill closure. She had chosen Jeanette Wall's memoir specifically because it spoke to the experiences many of her students were living through. That day, the discussion had turned to resilience, to finding strength in adversity. One student, Benjamin Hall, hadn't spoken in class all semester, Emma recalled. But that day, he raised his hand and talked about his own father's struggle with job loss. The whole class fell silent. It wasn't just a book discussion anymore. It was a moment of real connection, of understanding. Isabella listened as her mother continued, the stories flowing like a river finally unleashed. Emma told her about Sophia Anderson, who had been ready to drop out until she read Their Eyes Were Watching God and discovered her own worth. About William Nelson, who started a literacy program for younger students after graduating. About Charlotte Carter, who now taught English herself in the same school district. Mom, Isabella interrupted gently, you need to write these stories down, not just for yourself, but for all the teachers out there who might be wondering if they're making a difference, for all the students who need to believe their stories matter. Emma looked around her apartment, at the walls lined with bookshelves, each volume holding not just literature, but memories of discussions, of breakthroughs, of lives touched and changed. She thought about JD's visit, about how a single act of kindness, giving a book to a struggling student, could ripple outward through time, touching countless other lives. There's something else, Emma said, her voice growing stronger. He asked me to speak at a teachers' conference next month, about the power of literature to change lives, about the importance of believing in every student's potential. Oh, Mom, that's perfect. Will you do it? Emma hesitated, thinking about how long it had been since she'd stood in front of a crowd. But then she remembered the look in JD's eyes when he'd talked about her class, about how it had given him permission to dream bigger than his circumstances. Yes, she said firmly. Yes, I think I will. After hanging up, Emma pulled out her old teaching materials. She found the lesson plans from that year, the careful notes she'd made about each student's progress, the journal entries they'd written in response to the books they'd read. Each page held stories within stories, not just the literature they'd studied, but the real-life narratives of young people finding their way through words. She thought about Amelia Green, who'd been homeless that year but never missed a class, finding shelter in stories of triumph over adversity. About Lucas Turner, who discovered he could express his anger through poetry instead of fists. About Henry Phillips, whose college application essay about his grandmother's immigration story had earned him a full scholarship. The night deepened around her as she wrote, filling page after page with memories, insights, and revelations. She wrote about the quiet victories, the student who finally raised their hand, the reluctant reader who discovered a favorite book, the angry teenager who found solace in Shakespeare's sonnets. She wrote about the power of stories to build bridges between experiences, to help us understand lives different from our own. About how literature could be a mirror, showing us our own potential, and a window, revealing the vast possibilities beyond our current circumstances. Around midnight, Emma finally set down her pen. Her hand was cramped, but her heart felt fuller than it had in months. She realized that retirement hadn't ended her role as a teacher. It had given her a new platform, a new way to share the lessons she'd learned about the transformative power of education and belief. She picked up JD's book again, this time opening it to the dedication page. Through tears, she read, "To Mrs. Emma Turner, who taught me that stories are not just escapes, they are maps to better futures. You showed me that my story mattered. This book is part of your legacy." Legacy. The word echoed in her mind as she prepared for bed. She thought about all the students who had sat in her classroom over the years, each carrying their own stories, their own struggles, their own dreams. How many of them were out there now, touching other lives, creating their own ripples of change? Tomorrow, she would begin preparing for the conference speech. She would tell them about JD's visit, yes, but also about all the other students whose stories deserved to be heard. She would remind them that teaching was not just about imparting knowledge. It was about bearing witness to transformation, about holding space for possibility, about believing in potential that students themselves might not yet see. As she drifted off to sleep, Emma Turner smiled, thinking about how a single day, a single visitor had awakened her to the realization that her story wasn't over. It was simply taking a new form, reaching out to touch new lives in new ways. The chapter of daily classroom teaching might have ended, but the larger story, the one about the power of education to transform lives, was still very much being written. The next morning, Emma found herself standing in front of her bathroom mirror, rehearsing her conference speech. The words kept tangling in her throat, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she had too much to say. How could she possibly distill 38 years of teaching into 20 minutes? Her phone buzzed with a text from JD. "Just checked with the conference organizers. They've moved you to the main auditorium. There's been overwhelming interest since they announced your participation. No pressure, Mrs. Turner, but you might want to prepare for a bigger audience." Emma's hands trembled as she set down her phone. The main auditorium. She thought about Olivia Nelson, the shy girl who'd overcome her fear of public speaking by reciting Langston Hughes' poems. "Words give us wings," she used to tell her nervous students. Now she needed to take her own advice. She spent the morning sorting through more of her teaching materials, looking for stories that captured the essence of what she wanted to share. A stack of student thank you letters caught her eye, and she began to read. "Dear Mrs. Turner, I never told you this, but your class saved my life. Noah Baker, you saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. Ava Robinson. Because of you, I learned that my voice matters." James Hollich's letter unleashed a flood of memories. She remembered Noah Baker, how he'd started the year angry and withdrawn, but found solace in The Catcher in the Rye. Ava Robinson, who discovered her calling as a writer while analyzing Their Eyes Were Watching God. James Hall, who went from being a reluctant reader to publishing his own poetry in the school literary magazine. A knock at the door interrupted her reminiscing. It was William Hall, her neighbor, holding a newspaper. "Emma, have you seen this?" His eyes were bright with excitement as he handed her the local paper. There, on the front page of the community section, was a headline, "Celebrated author returns to thank former teacher." Emma sank into her chair reading the article. It wasn't just about JD's visit, it was about her entire teaching career. Former students had come forward to share their stories, creating a tapestry of testimonials about the impact she'd had on their lives. Liam Anderson, now a local business owner, recalled how she'd helped him apply for his first scholarship. Charlotte Green spoke about how Emma had attended her college graduation, beaming with pride from the audience. Michael Roberts shared how her encouragement had given him the confidence to become the first in his family to attend university. "This is why you need to give that speech," William said softly. Not just for JD, but for all of them, for all of us who were lucky enough to have teachers who believed in us. Emma nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She thought about all the faces that had passed through her classroom, all the stories that had unfolded within those walls. Each student had carried their own dreams, their own struggles, their own potential waiting to be unleashed. She remembered Isabella Clarke, who'd worked the night shift at the diner but never missed a morning discussion about Shakespeare. Benjamin Young, who'd overcome dyslexia to become an honor roll student. Sophia Turner, who found the courage to leave an abusive home after reading The Glass Castle. The conference was 2 weeks away, but Emma knew what she needed to do. She called Isabella, her daughter, and asked her to help set up a video call with as many former students as they could reach. "I need to hear their stories," she explained, "not just for the speech, but for myself. I need to understand what it all meant to them." Over the next few days, her small apartment became a virtual reunion space. Through her computer screen, she connected with dozens of former students, each eager to share how her class had influenced their lives. There was Henry Anderson, now a high school principal himself, who credited her with showing him the importance of seeing potential in every student. Amelia Phillips, who became a social worker after being inspired by their discussions about literature and social justice. Lucas Wright, whose college admission essay about their class discussions had earned him a full scholarship. Each conversation added another layer to her understanding of what teaching truly meant. It wasn't just about the books they'd read or the essays they'd written. It was about the moments of connection, the silent encouragements, the unwavering belief in their potential. As she prepared for the conference, Emma began to see her career differently. She wasn't just a retired teacher. She was a keeper of stories, a witness to countless transformations, a bridge between what was and what could be. The night before the conference, she sat at her desk, finalizing her speech. The words flowed, more easily now, carried by the current of all the stories she'd collected. She would tell them about JD, yes, but also about Noah and Ava and James, about Isabella and Benjamin and Sophia, about all the students who had taught her as much as she had taught them. She would tell them about the power of literature to open doors, to heal wounds, to build bridges across the chasms of experience, about how a single book placed in the right hands at the right moment could change the trajectory of a life. But most importantly, she would tell them about belief, the kind that sees past current circumstances to future possibilities, the kind that recognizes potential even when it's hidden beneath layers of doubt or defiance, the kind that says, "Your story matters, and I'm here to help you tell it." Emma glanced at the framed photo on her desk, her last class photo before retirement. Young faces smiled back at her, full of promise and possibility. She thought about where they might be now, what stories they might be writing with their lives. Her phone buzzed with another text from JD. "Just arrived in town. The auditorium is packed with your former students. They've come from all over. Ready to make us proud tomorrow, Mrs. Turner." Emma felt tears welling up, but they were different from the lonely tears she'd shed in those first months of retirement. These were tears of gratitude, of recognition, of coming full circle. She texted back, "Ready, these stories need to be told." As she prepared for bed that night, Emma thought about how a single visit had transformed her retirement from an ending into a beginning. She wasn't just going to give a speech tomorrow. She was going to pass the torch, to remind a new generation of teachers that their impact extends far beyond the classroom walls. She fell asleep, surrounded by letters, photos, and memories, her heart full of anticipation for tomorrow. In her dreams, she was back in her classroom, but this time all her students through the years were there, their voices joining in a chorus of stories that needed to be heard, of lives that had been changed, of dreams that had taken flight on the wings of words. The main auditorium was filled to capacity, but Emma Turner barely noticed the crowd as she made her way to the podium. Her focus was drawn to the familiar faces scattered throughout the audience. Generations of students who had once sat in her classroom, now here to support their former teacher. In the front row, J.D. sat beside William Hall and Isabella Wright, her daughter. Behind them, she recognized Noah Anderson, now a professor himself, and Olivia Green, who had become a celebrated journalist. Faces from different decades of her teaching career filled the rows, each one carrying a piece of her legacy. Emma adjusted the microphone, her hands steady now, despite her racing heart. The silence in the auditorium was expectant, charged with emotion. She looked down at her prepared speech, then set it aside. These weren't just educators waiting to hear a presentation. They were storytellers waiting to be reminded of their own power to change lives. 38 years ago, she began, her voice clear and strong, I walked into my first classroom believing I was there to teach literature. I was wrong. Literature was just the beginning, the key that unlocked doors to something far more profound. She told them about her first challenging student, Alexander Phillips, who had sat in the back of the room with his hood up, angry at the world. How Native's son had been the bridge that finally reached him, showing him that his anger was valid, that his story deserved to be told. Last week, Emma continued, a former student visited my apartment. Many of you know him as J.D. Vance, author of Hillbilly Elegy, but I remember him as the quiet boy who stayed after class to talk about books, who found in literature a reflection of his own experience, who dared to believe his story mattered. She saw J.D. nod slightly, his eyes glistening. In that moment, she wasn't seeing the successful author and public figure. She was seeing every student who had ever needed someone to believe in them. But this isn't just about one success story, Emma continued, her voice growing stronger. It's about Sophia Sanchez, who wrote her college essay about working in her parents' restaurant and is now a celebrated chef with her own cooking show. It's about James Carter, who discovered poetry while battling depression and now runs a youth mental health organization. It's about Charlotte Baker, who found her voice through Maya Angelou's words and became a civil rights attorney. Throughout the auditorium, heads nodded in recognition. These weren't just names, they were testaments to the transformative power of education, of belief, of seeing potential where others might see only limitations. Teaching isn't just about transferring knowledge, Emma said, moving away from the podium to stand closer to her audience. It's about being a witness to transformation. It's about holding space for possibility. It's about believing in someone until they're ready to believe in themselves. She told them about the difficult years when the steel mill closed, how literature became a lifeline for students facing uncertain futures. About Liam Roberts, who had been ready to drop out but found hope in The Grapes of Wrath, recognizing his family's struggle in the Jodes journey. About Mia Turner, who started a community library program after graduation, determined to share the gift of reading with others. Every book we teach is an invitation, Emma continued, her voice thick with emotion. An invitation to see beyond current circumstances, to imagine different possibilities, to recognize our own capacity for growth and change. But it's not just about the books. It's about the connections we forge through them. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. In the middle row, she spotted Benjamin Anderson, who had overcome a learning disability to become a special education teacher. Next to him sat Emma Nelson, now a published author herself, who had first discovered her love of writing in their classroom creative writing workshops. Last night, I reread hundreds of notes from former students, Emma said, her voice softening. One line kept appearing in different forms. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. That's our real job as educators. Beyond the lesson plans, Beyond the standardized tests, beyond the curriculum requirements, we're belief holders. We hold on to the belief in our students' potential until they're strong enough to carry that belief themselves. Tears were flowing, freely now, not just from Emma, but from many in the audience. She saw Olivia Roberts dabbing at her eyes, remembering perhaps the day she'd finally found the courage to share her poetry with the class. Henry Green was nodding vigorously, probably thinking of his own students now. To every educator in this room, Emma continued, her voice gaining strength again, I want you to know that your impact goes far beyond what you can see. Every word of encouragement, every moment of patience, every instance of choosing to believe. In a student's potential, these are seeds you're planting. Seeds that will grow in ways you might never witness, but that will bear fruit for generations to come. She told them about the ripple effect she'd discovered, how her students had gone on to touch countless other lives, about Michael Hall, who founded a literacy program in underserved communities, about Ava Young, whose work in education policy was shaping opportunities for a new generation of students, about Lucas Anderson, who returned to their hometown to teach in the same classroom where he had once been a struggling student. When I retired, Emma admitted, I thought my story was ending. I thought my chance to make a difference was over. But then JD knocked on my door, and I realized something profound. Our impact as teachers never really ends. It lives on in every life we touch, in every student who carries forward the belief we invested in them. She reached for the book JD had given her, holding it up for the audience to see. This advance copy represents more than just one success story. It represents every student who ever dared to dream bigger because someone believed they could. It represents every teacher who ever stayed late to help a struggling student, who ever bought books with their own money, who ever fought to keep hope alive in young hearts. Emma looked directly at the young teachers in the audience, her gaze intense with purpose. You might not have a student who writes a bestseller or becomes famous, but I guarantee you have students who will carry your belief in them for the rest of their lives. Students who will pass that belief on to others. Students whose lives will be forever changed because you chose to see their potential. The silence in the auditorium was profound, charged with shared understanding and purpose. Emma saw heads nodding, tears being wiped away, determined smiles appearing on faces young and old. So let me end with this, she said, her voice clear and strong. Teaching is not just a profession, it's a sacred trust. We're not just teaching subjects, we're teaching students to believe in themselves, to trust their voices, to dare to dream beyond their circumstances. Every day, in classrooms across this country, teachers are holding on to hope for students who haven't yet learned to hold it. And for themselves, that's not just education, that's magic, that's transformation, that's love. As Emma finished speaking, the auditorium erupted in applause, but it wasn't the applause that moved her most. It was the looks on the faces of her former students, each one reflecting back the belief she had once invested in them. She saw in their eyes the continuation of her story, the living legacy of a life dedicated to teaching not just literature, but hope itself. In that moment, standing before a room full of educators and former students, Emma Turner understood that retirement hadn't ended her teaching journey. It had simply opened a new chapter. Her story, like those of her beloved literary characters, would continue to unfold in the lives of every student she had ever taught, in every heart she had, helped to believe in its own potential.